This is Paul Holden. I'm from Shadow World Investigations. I am the Director of Investigations at Shadow World Investigations. For the last 3 or 4 years, Shadow World Investigations has been doing an extensive project on what we call state capture in South Africa. And that's involved a huge amount of work. It's involved investigating what are known as the Gupta leaks in South Africa, which is an enormous leak of data out of the Gupta family, who are said to have corrupted our president, Jacob Zuma, and a whole political elite, essentially. We have engaged with the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, made repeated submissions of evidence. I ended up giving about 10 days worth of evidence in total, oral evidence, before the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, looking at all of the ways in which the money stolen by the Guptas was looted out of the South African state, how it was looted, what contracts were affected, and then how they moved their illicit funds from South Africa into an incredibly complex money laundering system around the world. But I always get the question, and I think it's a very good and interesting question because there are many different answers. What is state capture? State capture is a relatively new term. It's got this sort of credibility and currency that people refer to. It has a sort of a, whenever somebody hears the phrase state capture, there's a sort of a sense of everybody already knows what it is. But I think what that's meant is that state capture has taken on too diffuse a meaning, and too many things are meant by it for it to be analytically or even legally useful. So to begin with, I think we need to start with the most basic definition. One is corruption. I think most people know what corruption is. The traditional definition of corruption is the offering of a benefit of some kind, an illicit benefit, in order to receive a gain of some kind. Traditionally, that's paying a bribe to a decision maker to make a decision that goes your way. Within that, there are two types of corruption. There's one is petty corruption and one called grand corruption. Petty corruption is very simple. It's if you're driving down the street and you get pulled over and a traffic cop wants to fine you for driving over the speed limit, and you pay them a certain amount of money to make the fine go away. That's petty corruption. It's one-off, it's small, it involves one person, usually a small amount of money. Grand corruption, which is a phrase that really came into currency in the late 90s and early 2000s, really is just about the size and the scale of the corruption involved. It's a substantial piece of government procurement that has been implicated in corruption in some way, usually through kickbacks or whatever mechanism of corruption is involved. The key thing with grand corruption is the size, of course. It needs to be a very substantial piece of public procurement. It can't just be, buying a couple of syringes for the local hospital or something like that. It's usually a big state procurement, like an energy production facility, like a power station, or it's defense procurement, so buying a set of fighter jets, or it's paying for the building of a huge amount of construction work or infrastructure work around railway. It tends to focus on those industries that are grand projects, that do grand infrastructure and design projects, because those are the ones where the most amount of state money has to be spent on private contractors. It's supposed to involve the highest levels of the state. Grand corruption is different from ordinary corruption, day-to-day corruption, in that it implicates the most senior decision makers in a state. And the reason why that's important is because once the senior decision makers in a state are implicated, they have the power, first of all, to oversee the corrupt deal itself, but then also to block accountability. They can use their power, perhaps as the president, say, to stop Parliament investigating, or fire the chief of police who's trying to investigate a corrupt scandal. The thing about grand corruption that sets it apart from state capture is that grand corruption is it's opportunistic. It's usually one-off. It's usually one procurement or one deal. It's not a systemic process. It's not happening on an ongoing process. There may be a whole range of knock-on effects of grand corruption that may last for a very long period of time as the people who gain money try to cover that up. But it's essentially one deal, one large amount of money, one transaction where there's one set of bribes or one set of benefits that are earned. Probably the best examples of those are arms deals. The most famous of all is the Al Yamama deal, which involved billions of pounds worth of procurement and substantially similar levels of bribery being paid to Saudi officials, and also kickbacks coming back into the UK. In the South African example, it would be what we call our 1999 arms deal, where we spent, then was supposed to be 30 billion rands worth of very scarce public resources on fighter jets and submarines and helicopters, which we've basically never used and never will use, now worth probably in the 100 billion rand range rather than 30 billion rand range. There was a vast amount of kickbacks as well, and implicated at least two state presidents, one in direct corrupt wrongdoing, which is Jacob Zuma, and the other in just maladministration, which is Thabo Mbeki. And in both cases, they were empowered to use the state to prevent investigations into their conduct. And that's a classic example of grand corruption. It's a single transaction or a single set of transactions, very large, usually a procurement from an outside supplier, vast amounts of money, huge scope for kickbacks, implicating the most senior members of a state with all the implications that involves. But in order to understand state capture, we have to go somewhere not criminal, which is what's known as institutional corruption. Now, institutional corruption is a phrase that's been most commonly developed and set up by an academic called Lawrence Lessig. And his idea was to try and capture, by definition and by experience and case study, something that we all sort of understand but can't really describe, which is, very simply, you have these institutions in society that are supposed to act in one way, but actually act in another way. Now, that's not because they criminally implicated any wrongdoing, but because influences are brought to bear on them so they don't perform their original function. And Lessig's classic example is Congress in the United States. So you have defense contractors, you have pretty much every industry in the world, actually, foreign governments even, offering lobbying funds to congressmen, paying for their election campaigns, putting in money into their favored super PACs in order to help them get elected. And what that does is that it means those congressmen are no longer singularly or solely focused on delivering the best for their constituents. Instead, they're focused on delivering what's best for the people who are paying their lobbying funds. The key thing there is that, first of all, it's not illegal. It's totally legal to do that. It's a different question as to whether it's ethical, but actually what you'll find is that most of the people who are involved in that don't believe it's unethical. They think it's just the way that their business operates, that this is the way government works. Business is a stakeholder. They are allowed to influence policy. They are a big part of society. We should listen to them. So institutional corruption is taking an institution, making sure it doesn't work like people want it to, or how it should work. And it's being done so because it's being subject to influences outside of it, which divert it from its intended function. So lobbying is the best example. I think the best way to understand state capture, and I'll go into some key specifics around state capture in South Africa, which I think is the most developed example of state capture we can talk about. But state capture is somewhere between a molding and a melding of institutional corruption and grand corruption into one system. It's usually very high-level corruption involving the most senior people in the state, usually huge sums of money. It involves a systematic process of perverting the institutions of government at all levels. So that's not just the procurement sector, it's policy making. It is deciding what to buy in order to generate the opportunities for corruption. It is making sure that Parliament, which is a key mode of accountability in most societies and where this sort of thing can be stopped, is somehow co-opted or goes along with a particular plan. You have institutional corruption where it's not illegal what happens in Parliament. If Parliament decides, there was a very famous case in South Africa where there was a vote in Parliament where there was a no confidence vote in Jacob Zuma because of state capture, because of his involvement in corruption. And ANC MPs voted it down, which was heavily criticised in the press by the opposition parties, even by Judge Raymond Zondo, who's now the Chief Justice, who led the Zondo Commission of Inquiry. But they weren't doing anything illegal. What they were doing, though, is responding to the instructions of their political bosses. In South Africa, all MPs are appointed by parties, and those parties are headed by their presidents, and their presidents can decide who represents who in Parliament and what they should vote on. So none of those MPs broke the law in defending Jacob Zuma. But I think we all have a sense as South Africans, and certainly this was Chief Justice Raymond Zondo's point, is that there's something had gone wrong there, that their loyalty lay where it shouldn't have lain. It should have lain with their oath, with the constitution, with the people of South Africa, rather than their political bosses. And that's how you get to state capture, is to meld grand corruption and institutional corruption. In the final report of Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, he had a whole volume which is basically dedicated to what do we mean by state capture in the South African context. Sadly, I was hoping when he wrote that he would write an abstract guide to how state capture would look in every country. Instead, he said, no, I think I'll limit myself just to the South African example. But even that has some key features that we can highlight and I think will be reproduced in other cases of state capture. First of all, he identified scale, so grand corruption. It has to be huge sums of money and it has to implicate the most senior people. The second thing, and this is probably the most important, is it's not opportunistic. It is systemic. It is he called it a project. The project of state capture in South Africa, led by the Gupta family, involving Jacob Zuma and a whole cast of implicated senior politicians and business people and multinational companies, was a project. It was a racketeering enterprise. Effectively, what the Guptas had set up was a criminal business, and their entire profit model was to get people in the state, get people at every level of the state to make sure that there are procurements that they would benefit from. And then within the state, making sure that when a procurement happens, it went to the right people. What it also meant was that the Guptas could act as gatekeepers. So even if they personally were going to be involved in a procurement, there wasn't a deal going to them personally or to their companies or to their IT companies, they would act as a gatekeeper. So international companies would say, well, we're never going to get a deal unless we deal with the Guptas. We have to pay the Guptas bribes. And once we pay the Guptas bribes, they'll swing the contract. So it's a project. It's an enterprise. It is systemic. It implicates a whole range of institutions, and it's policy focused. And what do I mean by that? It's very simple. Grand corruption, a deal comes up, people collude together in a moment of opportunity to make as much money as they can illicitly. Here, the plan is to take the state and repurpose it so that the state specifically procures goods and services that don't necessarily benefit the citizenry, but will eventually generate an income for the state capture project and the racketeering enterprise. So probably the best example of that in South Africa is the famous 1064 locomotive procurement, where South Africa bought a huge number of locomotives from different countries. And in that case, what happened was that I think it's about 7 billion rands worth of bribes were eventually paid to the Guptas by Chinese rail manufacturers. The whole decision to pursue that particular transaction, the manner in which that transaction played out, was done in order to generate the conditions in which corruption could happen. What he also identifies, Chief Justice Raymond Zondo, is how this corruption happens. And it's about people, which should be quite obvious, but many people don't really get this. It's about taking people and putting loyal people at every level of the state in order to ensure that there's no pushback against a particular corrupt procurement, or that the people in the state have the power to prevent accountability. So if there are people, good people in the state who want to prevent corruption, they are controlled, they are limited, they are pushed back on. So it's about putting people at the highest levels of the state. In South Africa, that involved things like putting everybody who's connected to the Guptas on the board of Eskom, which is the state electricity manufacturer. So probably the best example of that is the 2014 Eskom board, which is a terrifying piece of state capture, where the vast majority of the board members were either directly in business with the Guptas or somehow linked to them or wanted to be in business with the Guptas. It got so bad that the Guptas' most senior lieutenant, a guy called Sally Messer, was quite literally telling the board who should go onto the various board subcommittees, procurement subcommittees, and directing how the organization ran itself. We have a program, it's systemic, it's planned, it's a racketeering enterprise involving a combination of actors inside and outside of the state who are working together to ensure that procurement happens in a way that generates the opportunities for corruption. And then when those opportunities are generated, making sure the corruption actually does happen. The third feature of it is the implication and the dismantling of accountability mechanisms. So probably the best example of that is Parliament, which in South Africa, sadly, has not been effective as an accountability mechanism for a very long time. More disturbingly was the capture of other institutions like the South African Revenue Service, which is our our state tax body, which has an investigative function. And there's a huge amount of work that Chief Justice Raymond Zondo did in understanding the way in which the Revenue Service was effectively captured as part of the state capture project, in order to destroy the capacity of the state to investigate money laundering and wrongdoing. The other aspect of that is obviously law enforcement, making sure the police in particular were handpicked, that they knew that their careers were based entirely on looking the other way in important deals. The one area where state capture didn't succeed, interestingly, in South Africa, which is probably our godsend in the end, was that it failed, despite attempts, to capture the judiciary. So the judiciary remained relatively independent and relatively immune from state capture. And that meant that, for a while at least, South Africans had a mechanism of stopping, preventing, limiting, seeking accountability for state capture through the judiciary. The fourth feature, and I think this is probably the most interesting one, and one that people pay the least amount of attention to, it is a specific campaign by this group of criminal actors inside and outside of the state to create a discursive set of misinformation to represent state capture in a positive light, in order to make sure that citizens are either confused about what's going on or support it. And the best example of that is when the Guptas hired a very, very, very famous UK PR firm called Bell Pottinger. Bell Pottinger, for decades, had represented some of the worst people in society: Saudi dictators, Margaret Thatcher, and they provided services to make sure that those people weren't reflected on badly in the press. They would, make sure the right sort of newspaper articles are written. They would make sure that the right words were said to editors to sort of soften the coverage of wrongdoing. What the Guptas did was they hired Bell Pottinger to try and deal with the extent of state capture allegations in South Africa. And what Bell Pottinger did, an incredible story, really incredibly unethical story, is that they decided to create a bot army on Twitter, and also identify journalists who they could tap up, and created this narrative that state capture didn't exist, that state capture was a myth. And in fact, it was a myth that had been created by what they called white monopoly capital in South Africa, that they were racist white South Africans, although with some of their collaborators who are not white, who were angry at the way in which a black-led government was transforming the economy. And that's actually what underpinned the allegations of corruption. Of course, it was totally false, and anybody with half a brain could see through it. And eventually what happened, because Bell Pottinger's scheme was so poor, people started realizing that it was a bot army. And when the Gupta leaks happened, suddenly the emails all came out showing the Guptas actually hiring Bell Pottinger and them deciding to create a highly racialized narrative in South Africa in order to stop state capture. So those are the four features that we look for in state capture in South Africa. First of all, it's systemic. It's a systemic project that involves actors inside and outside of the state. It works by ensuring that key people are placed at all levels of the state, from the person who receives a tender all the way to a board chairperson. It involves grand corruption in the sense that the transactions usually targeted are large-scale government procurements, usually around infrastructure. It imbricates and it implicates the mechanisms of accountability to make sure that law enforcement can't tackle it and prevent it happening. And then finally, there's a discursive element to it. There's a political element to it, where an argument is made that state capture is either not happening or that it's a good thing. And those features come together to create a relatively unique set of factors to describe state capture. What's disturbing about state capture is that at its height, at its moment of control, at its zenith, it is a incredibly efficient, sophisticated, and self-sustaining model. And I think what's quite scary about the Gupta family is that they were quite astute in the way they used their corrupt money. They didn't just get kickbacks and bribes and then, spend it just on cars or luxury weddings, although they did spend it on those things as well. So they would take state capture money and they would buy other assets that they could use to benefit from state capture. Best example, of course, is the purchase of what was known as Optimum Coal Mine, where they used a huge amount of money from state capture, 1.8 billion rand, according to my calculations, of money stolen from various government procurements to buy this mine, in order to use the mine to get more corrupt contracts from Eskom, which they eventually did. In incredibly corrupt and damning circumstances. So it generates its momentum the asset base of the Gupta enterprise increases, and its asset base is designed to create the opportunities for further policy, perversion, and corruption. The question is, what stopped it? What stopped it in South Africa? And I suppose that it's a combination of a number of things. One was civil society, that generally speaking, the media remained relatively uncaptured, although the Guptas did their best by creating their own TV station, by creating their own newspaper, which speaks to the discursive disinformation element of state capture. But generally speaking, the media remained independent and it retained its investigative function. The second thing is historic happy accident. Just the fact that Gupta leaks came to fruition, that somebody somehow got a copy of the email servers of one of the most senior Gupta lieutenants and made it available to journalists and law enforcement. And suddenly, in that moment, the disinformation, the discursive formation that protected state capture fell apart in a heartbeat, because suddenly we had the primary evidence. These are the emails being sent to various people around the country and around the world to make sure dodgy procurements happened, to make sure that kickbacks were arranged, and really had identified the scope, the scale, and the content of the Gupta enterprise network, both from an employee point of view, but also from a government official point of view. So that's state capture in a nutshell. I think it's important for us to understand how it differs from other types of corruption, because the way we deal with state capture is very different to how you deal with petty corruption or grand corruption or even institutional corruption.